This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, I'm John Moorhead. I am the host of the Multi-Faith Matters podcast, and I am privileged today to have as my special guest a colleague and a co-worker. We work together on a project, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, Darryl Caterine. And I'm going to read your bio from that I found on various sources, so hopefully it's up to date. If not, you can correct me here. Darryl Caterine is a professor of religious studies at LeMoyne College. He is a historian of religions whose research focuses on the intersections of religion, culture, and politics in the U.S. and parts of Latin America. His areas of academic research include metaphysical, occult religions in America, and religion and popular culture. He is the author and co-editor of several books, including an ethnography titled Haunted Ground, Journals Through a Paranormal America, which we're going to talk about today, which is really cool. And the volume that he and I co-edited together, The Paranormal and Popular Culture, a Postmodern Religious Landscape. And if folks are not listening but watching on YouTube, there's a little not so unabashed share and promotion of the volume there. So Darryl, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, John. It's really great to be here.
Well, like you and I were talking before we started recording, and this is the first face-to-face we've had. We've had a ton of email exchanges as we co-edited the book. We had one phone call before we actually started the volume, but this is our first face-to-face. So it's cool to tackle an important topic and to actually be able to see you as we have the conversation. So I'm jazzed about it. Now, the background for our conversation is recently the U.S. government, the Pentagon, released a report on UFOs, or I think they're trying to use a new term now to make it less fringy, if you will, unidentified aerial phenomenon, UAP. So yes. This podcast here is a part of a mini series that I'm doing in response to that. And I like to begin my conversations with people to get a little personal background. How in the world does an academic, a scholar working in the area of religions, come to develop a personal as well as academic interest in studying the paranormal?
That is a great question, and there's more than one way to answer it. One of the ways I think that I got into this, I'll start with the academic part first, is you mentioned in the bio that a subset of my research interests focuses on Latino and Latin American religious phenomena. And once you get into that world, the miraculous, let's just call it that, the miraculous is a really big part of that religious landscape. So I was looking for something kind of analogous to that in the United States setting to study as a researcher. And it was what we call the paranormal that had the same kind of vibe, to what you get down in south of the border, say. On a more personal note, I guess I think that there's a heavy overlap between some of the paranormal stuff and what we might just call mysticism in the field of religion. And I would never be so pretentious as to identify myself as a mystic, but I do contemplative practices and such. So there's a kind of affinity there. And then the last thing I'll say is that when I was researching for my book that you mentioned, Haunted Ground, I went into Lilydale, which is a spiritualist community of mediums here in New York, which is where I'm presently located. I went into that community as a pretty agnostic, kind of secular trained academic. And I just started having a few experiences there that didn't comfortably fit. That's kind of a polite way of saying that I kind of like got my mind blown there.
Right.
Whatever was going on, it was not normal as far as I could tell. And so that really kind of shifted the way that I think about all of this material, including the UFO stuff. So
now how long has this been of interest to you? For me, I don't know what our relative ages are here. I'm a child. I grew up in the 1970s.
Okay.
And so back then in pop culture, you had documentaries and pseudo documentaries on UFOs and the paranormal. It was in television programs. It was in horror films and science fiction. And the UFO phenomenon was all over the place. I remember, in fact, just recently, last night, I rewatched the story of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case from the 1960s, and that was made into a TV movie in 1975. And so I have always had an interest, and I kind of set it aside years later with some more conservative religious commitments. But then I kind of revisited and thought, why is that? Why is it some religious phenomena, that's okay, that's orthodox, and others aren't? And so I kind of picked it up again and have made it an area of not only personal passion, but also academic interest. So for me, it's been quite some time since the 1970s. Has it been a long-term interest for you?
I would have to say, well, first of all, I think we're pretty much of the same generation. I grew up during the 70s and early 80s as well. I'd have to say that for me, it's a little bit more recent than that. I tend to be very attracted to thinking about and studying things that are in my immediate area. So I think, for example, the interest in Latin American Latino stuff emerged from when I was in California as a graduate student and just looking around me. Now here, right now, I'm in upstate New York, and I've been here for about 15 years now. And as you know, John, and as many of your viewers or listeners might also know, upstate New York was a hotbed, not only of the paranormal, but all sorts of new religious movements in the 19th century. And even today, I would consider New York, for reasons that I can't give you a rational explanation for, it's kind of a hotbed. It's a kind of what the Scots would call a thin place. For example, many of my students and their parents and relatives, most of whom are coming from at least a cultural Catholic background, it's not uncommon for them to talk about visitations to mediums. Oh, my mother is, she has a psychic that she goes to. And I've never lived in a part of the United States before that has that kind of charge. So what I'm getting to is it's my interest in the paranormal, I think, has a lot to do with where I'm living right now in New York. And since that's only been for about 15 years, my interest started probably back in around 2000 about 15 years ago, 2005, 2006, as I started kind of looking around and thinking, where am I? So.
Well, it's got to be a great place to live and do research. I mean, all kinds of things, from, the roots of Mormonism, the Hudson Valley UFO sightings, all kinds of things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's deal with the elephant in the room up front. One, how are we defining the paranormal? So this is a two-part question. And secondly, as an academic, as you know, one of the reasons we tried to put together this volume on the postmodern paranormal is because we wanted to send a message to scholars that this was serious phenomenon worthy of their study. Why study it at all? What's the case to be made for that, and how are we defining it?
Great question. So I am going to riff off of our friend Jeffrey Kripal here,
okay.
Who, as you know, John, he teaches down at Rice University and has kind of pioneered the study of the paranormal within the purview of religious studies. And to just kind of paraphrase Jeffrey Kripal, I would define the paranormal as it's really a set of experiences. That's one thing to note. It's a set of experiences and people who study those experiences. And these experiences are betwixt and between what we would probably call religious experience and the kind of phenomena that's of interest to scientists. So I would say paranormal phenomena are these sort of liminal or in-between phenomena that can't be easily reduced to either conventional religious or mainstream scientific worldviews. As a start, that's sort of how I would frame a lot of paranormal phenomena. And why should we be interested in it as people who are interested in American religion? Well, right now, I think it is the fastest rising religious demographic in the United States is the spiritual but not religious, which itself is an in-between category, somewhere in between conventional religion and secular scientific worldview. And so there's not a one-to-one correspondence between SBNR and spiritual but not religious and paranormal, but those two things are heavily overlapping. And I think to better understand what's going on with the spiritual but not religious, we can benefit by taking a close look at the paranormal. So
do you think within that definition, I really like that definition, it's quoted in our book. Do you think within that definition is really the foundation for why this tends to be so marginalized? On the one hand, it doesn't fit into neat scientific categories that can be tested or a scientific, let me rephrase it, a naturalistic worldview. And it also runs counter many times to religious orthodoxy. It does in certain segments of even Christianity has its so-called unorthodox mystical kinds of experiences. Do you think because it is in that middle space, it offends all parties equally, and that's why it's marginalized?
I like to say that the paranormal has very few friends. Yes, indeed. And I had that experience. My faculty members, I teach at a Jesuit college, which is probably one of the few places where I could get so much support and get away with this. They've been politely tolerant, I guess. That said, I think, when I was doing PR for Haunted Ground, my first book, I hired an agent to connect me with various interviews and such. And I found myself unknowingly, I didn't realize one evening I was doing an interview with, I don't know if it was a conservative Christian radio program or if it was just a radio program somewhere down in the Bible Belt in the South. But immediately I found myself kind of in a defensive position. I was getting questions like, how could anybody who has any kind of background in rational studies, be looking at this? And it was really suspect. And I would say, this is just speculation, but I think it's true. I think if I were in a more secular public university, it would be more difficult to look at this. So yeah. And I just want to throw in, it's really not part of your question, but it's related, something about the sociology of knowledge. It's been interesting to me to kind of watch, as soon as there is a kind of social endorsement by the United States military that, okay, I'm talking now, thinking about UFOs. Okay, now it's all right to think about this. Everyone gets on the bandwagon. And before that time, everybody's kind of tiptoeing around. So I think there's something in there about, the sociology of knowledge, and to put it politely, herd mentality might be a blunter way of putting the case. So
yeah, it was interesting to see with the there was speculation for weeks about this government report, what it was going to say or what it wasn't. Yeah. And it was interesting to see the immediate polarization between those who were debunking. Even before the report came out, I saw this one guy saying, well, this is probably this. And I thought, well, for me, I would hope that the United States government has people with his areas of expertise who've already taken those steps and ruled that out. But you have the debunkers on the one hand, and then you have what I call the true believers on the other hand, who immediately jump to, it must be flying saucers or something like that. So there's this polarization that's out there. Personally, I'm not too interested in having either of those poles. I'm more interested in what does the continued popularity of the paranormal tell us about the human desire for transcendence and spirituality and meaning making and those kinds of things. Does that resonate at all with you and your research?
Yes, it does. I'll speak to that in straightforwardly, and then I'll say a little bit about how I kind of think about it. But yes, the search for transcendence, and I think that the real value of the paranormal, and this is really a theological statement right now. The dominant society is secular, it's naturalistic, to use your word. I think that's a great word. And, I think that that's a huge barrier to anybody trying to cultivate any kind of faith or any kind of orientation to the transcendent. And I think the paranormal really acts best as a kind of solvent. I think that it's very tricksterish, and it does a really good job in kind of pulling the rug out from underneath the feet of sort of dyed-in-the-wool secularists, And, even Michael Shermer, it's funny you should mention the polarization, because just this morning I was reading an older, maybe it was back in May of this year, Michael Shermer speaking out on the UFOs, and this has something to do with, optical stuff with the cameras. But, there's a really interesting story about Michael Shermer in Jeffrey Kripal's book, The Flip. And just to kind of paraphrase, Michael Shermer, the arch secular skeptic, I think it was when he was getting married, and in preparation for his wedding, he was in a room somewhere with his fiance, and the radio suddenly turned itself on to Shermer's fiance's father's favorite song. Of course, the father had been dead for some time. And even Shermer, had to say something like, well, I don't really know what happened. And even if it was an electrical phenomenon, the fact that there was a meaningful coincidence with that particular song is something that I'm not going to try to, explain away. So I think, again, just to kind of wrap up there, the paranormal it's a trickster, and it pokes holes in this barrier of secular naturalistic materialism. So
one of the surveys that I try and keep on top of as they release new versions of it, the Chapman University Survey of American Fears, which is fascinating because they include a segment on the paranormal. And the most recent one that I saw was from that I downloaded was from 2018. And it listed different percentages of paranormal phenomena and people who in America who adhere to this. 58%, the highest number, but people believe that places are haunted by spirits. 57% advanced civilizations of the past, like Atlantis and that kind of thing. 41% believe aliens have visited Earth in the ancient past. 35% aliens have come to Earth in modern times. And so goes on to cryptoids and various things like that. So this is and as I've kept track of this survey there, the numbers either remain steady or they continue to rise. Now, you mentioned Michael Shermer in your last comment. He did an article, I don't remember where it was, but it was fascinating. As a skeptic, he opined that perhaps the possibility of alien civilizations, the belief in advanced alien civilizations, can function for skeptics like God does for religious people. So it would seem that even a noted skeptic like Shermer recognizes that human beings have a desire for transcendence. How do you see people looking for signals of transcendence, to borrow a term from Peter Berger, in the paranormal phenomenon?
Wow, that's really interesting about Shermer's. It's really sort of astrotheology, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like you were talking about earlier. Well, I think there are a bunch of ways. To me, the one that jumps right out is research on near-death experiences. To just kind of put it bluntly, I think a lot of secular skeptical people in relation to religion are kind of asking the basic question of, is there a there? Let's just bracket the idea of God for the moment and just say, is it true that we have a soul? I mean, no soul, no religion, as far as I can tell. So something like a near-death experience is sort of in the bullseye of this, what I would think, not all, obviously, but many religious people would be very interested in this. Apparently, we've got, a lot of, I don't want to call it empirical data because it's always experiential, right? But this really shocking data of people who have been pronounced clinically dead, and they have these experiences that, call it heaven or nirvana or whatever you want to, it's a placeholder, but they go to this wonderful place. They see deceased relatives and, talk about unconditional love. So I'll just stop with that. That's a great example of a paranormal phenomenon that is in the bullseye of people's search for transcendence. And I'll just add that, a lot of the way I think about this comes from my day-to-day work as a teacher, and again, a lot of my students are culturally Catholic, but basically secular. And I've been really moved in particularly with the material of near-death experiences. I've been really moved to listen to how that kind of data affects my students in terms of their it's not quite faith. It's not that they emerge from these classes, they haven't returned back to Roman Catholicism, but they know that death is not the end, or they're pretty sure that death is not the end. And to me, that's a beautiful thing. So I'll just stick with that.
Yeah. Well, near-death experiences is fascinating. I've followed that over the years as well. But what's interesting, even with specific phenomenon, you still have the polarization. I've seen skeptics who just discount everything as a naturalistic experience within the brain in the final moments of life or would-be final moments. And then you have, again, the true believers, usually of a more new age kind of orientation. Sometimes Christians will try and draw upon that, but most of the time for them, it's off base and it's demonic experiences. So it's fascinating how the whole set of paranormal phenomena can often result in this polarization. And so do specific examples within itself. So
yes,
that's fascinating. Let me throw out one other example of how people are searching or finding transcendence in the paranormal. I had a guest, Ted Peters, a theologian out of Berkeley, who does astrotheology, and he noted, even at so-called secular conferences on the possibility of alien life, he saved the program. And there was a presentation on the possibility that this alleged advanced alien life that has survived their own destruction, traveled across the stars to come here to visit us, may result in our salvation here on Earth. So there's an investment even in some interpretations of alien life with a savior kind of mentality. So it's fascinating how these people are finding spiritual or even religious connotations in what's going on in the paranormal.
Oh, that's fascinating. And if I could just throw it in, John, I said I was just going to note how at this point in my research, where I stand vis-a-vis the UFO stuff. And I'm increasingly persuaded by the so-called ultra-terrestrial hypothesis that, and I'm thinking now specifically about the work of Jacques Vallée, who, of course, well-established scientists who work with J. Allen Hynek and on the, et cetera. But that perhaps what we're dealing with here is better thought of as some kind of entities, as opposed to extraterrestrials, entities coming from outside of space and time. If that's the case, just taking that hypothesis on face value, that immediately gets into the area, and here's a kind of, gesture to maybe some of the religious conservatives, what might in the old days have been called demonology, or perhaps or angelology, discernment. I don't think we're at a point now with this where we can even talk about discernment, but that would be right again in the bullseye of what could be more religious than angels and demons, if that in fact is what they are.
Yeah, Vallée's work is fascinating, and he certainly problematizes the what I think he's called the nuts and bolts spaceship hypothesis, the ETH, extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is kind of the go-to thing. Well, if UFOs are real, what they mean by real is it must be extraterrestrial visitors. But he points out, he's got these fascinating little charts, the wide variety of depictions of spacecraft, of aliens. So we've either got, if alien visitation is possible, it would probably be very rare given all the dynamics involved. but we've got this cosmopolitan phenomenon going on with its diversity. So if you're going to come up, have the ET hypothesis, you've got to account for the kinds of things that Vallée is pointing out. So I highly recommend his work. You mentioned in a prior email a book of his that you had read that that was starting to change your mind. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just finished his book Trinity, which is basically, it centers around the sighting of two Hispano boys in New Mexico, who, when interviewed, are now, obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, but are now fully grown men. This happened in 1945. Oh, wow. 30 miles away from where they detonated the first atomic bomb at White Sands in New Mexico. And so Vallée thinks this is very important for two reasons. First, that it pushes the date of modern UFO sightings back from, it's usually dated right from Kenneth Arnold's 1947, back 2 years. But even more importantly, it links it explicitly with the detonation of these atomic bombs. So there's a kind of, he doesn't really go into that, more by way of allusion that we've somehow, upset a balance or attracted the attention or woken up something. So yeah, it's called Trinity. I forget who the co-author is. The co-author is an Italian ufologist who conducted extensive interviews with these two men. And what they saw was it was about, I think, 30 days after the detonation of the test bomb. And they lived on a ranch out in rural New Mexico, and they were out in the backcountry on their horses. And they're both children now, maybe 7 or 8 or something like this. And they saw some smoke, coming up from an arroyo, and they went over. And when the smoke cleared, there was, according to their testimony, there was an egg-shaped craft and these humanoid beings, short, maybe around 5 feet tall, in coveralls. And they were kind of gliding around the object. And they were kind of emitting this screeching noise that one of the witnesses described as like, the noise that a rabbit makes when it's scared. And so that's what they saw. And then this is very interesting, I think. We're always talking about who knows what and is there a conspiracy? Well, Vallée points out that this whole area was actually under the purview of the Atomic Energy Commission, not the conventional military. So they have their own, I don't know about this, but apparently they've got their own kind of authority and purview. They came in almost immediately because their radars picked up on an object, and they just, this is before flying saucer was even a word. This was before the extraterrestrial hypothesis was even a paradigm. So there was just this thing that shouldn't have been there. And according to these witnesses, the AEC built a paved road into this area of the ranch, and eventually sent the semi in with a crane, put this egg-shaped object on the back of a truck. And the soldiers who were, doing all this grunt work, again, as far as they were concerned, this was just some weird craft, So they'd take a lunch break and leave this place deserted. So these two little boys went up to the truck, and one of them actually went underneath the tarp on the semi and went inside of this thing, this craft. There was nothing, there was either nothing in it or it had been gutted out by that time, with the exception of one aluminum kind of lever that looks suspiciously like an Earth manufactured lever. But anyway, and then it was hauled away. But since that time, the AEC or whoever now, is in charge of that land, they've come in, they've altered the landscape, they put in landfill, they've planted poisonous plants in that area where the craft was. So anybody with a Geiger counter or what have you is going to get, terrible hives and so forth. So it's a fascinating story of whatever it is,
Yeah.
So that's Vallée's recent most. Yeah.
I'll have to check it out. I've read a lot of his stuff, but I haven't read that one. So I'll have to seek that out. Let's talk about your first book, your ethnography. I was recently reminded that I have way too many books because in preparation for this interview, I was looking at your bio and I thought, oh, I need to order his ethnography. And I ordered it and it was in transit. And then I was checking my section of my library on the paranormal, and there it was. I'm like, oh, that's right, I already ordered it. So I returned it, thankfully, but rather than having, not that I don't want 2 copies of your work, but I didn't think I needed it. You wrote this ethnography. You're taking this journey across America and looking at certain paranormal areas. What led you to do that? What kind of experiences did you have along the way?
So, well, as I mentioned earlier, the first prompt, I guess you could say, was being here in upstate and learning that, and actually going to this place down the road here called Lilydale, which is kind of like a time capsule of the Great Awakening, or maybe a little towards the tail end of it, when spiritualism, mediumship was all the rage in the 19th century. It's a community of mediums about 50 miles southwest of Buffalo, New York, and it was founded in 1879. So I went there, loved it. I mean, just in terms of its aesthetics, it's real kind of old, weird America, And so I thought, well, it would be, I'd already done ethnographic work as a graduate student on Latin American religion. I thought, well, how can I do an ethnography, on the paranormal? So initially I was thinking, well, maybe it would be fun to study crop circles, but as a colleague of mine pointed out, by the time I got there, they'd be gone. So I thought, well, that's a good point. So then I finally landed on, for lack of a better word, kind of like paranormal gatherings. So Lilydale, that's open to the public every summer. People converge. Great. I can interview folks. I ended up with Lilydale, the Roswell UFO Festival out in New Mexico. And then as my third selection, I landed on the American Society of Dowsers, just because dowsing always sort of, it never quite makes it onto the map of the paranormal, but it's a fascinating, better known as water witching.
Yes.
And, goes back to colonial times. And, farmers would use this as a method of allegedly finding water, underground water to dig wells. So anyway, so those are my three sites. And in terms of things that happened to me, I guess I'd have to say the things, the hot spot for me was Lilydale. And I'll just tell you, I don't even know where to begin. I've had so many strange experiences at Lilydale. Just to give you one night, I had been doing research there, and I said to my wife, I said, you've got to check this place out. It's just really, it's kooky and it's crazy and it's fun. So we were there together, and one night we were walking along the shores of Lake Casadega, because the camp is on the shores of this lake. And truly, just in jest, I was in the middle of trying to write this book. And in jest, I just said, okay, if there's anybody listening, I really want some help or something like that on this book, just as a joke. So we took a few more steps, and my wife looked out at the lake. It's around dusk now. And she said, what is that? Is that a duck? And I looked out at the water, and there was this swiftly moving object coming towards us. And I said, no, I don't think that's a duck. She said, well, what is it? And we realized, and this is such a strange story, John, but I swear on my father's grave that this has happened. It was, I won't say it was the size of the Loch Ness monster, but let's just say it was a very, very huge water snake, maybe 10 or 15 feet. I mean, this thing was, that what we thought was a duck was its head. So we were like, kind of freaked out, and the thing kind of swam away. And then we walked down a few 100 yards down the lake, and there were these ladies standing on a kind of on the end of a dock that's there. and they were just staring into the water. And we called out to them and we said, "Did you just see that?" And they said, "My God." They said, "Yeah, what was that? I've never seen a water snake that big." So now to end the story, so I was telling people who live there, all summer long what had happened. And they said, "Well, what are you talking about? We've never seen that." And, it was just bizarre. I mean, that's just, who knows what that was? Maybe that's just a naturalistic phenomenon. I had one interesting meeting with a practitioner of Santeria from Cuba, who was visiting Lilydale with her friend Barbara, a Cuban American from Miami. And I spent a night with them doing a Santeria style seance down at the same dock that I just mentioned. And among other things that happened during that event, the Santeria went into a trance, and she started to describe in very precise detail the scene of my father's death. He died at home many, many years ago. And she described the time of day, a particular ring that he had on his finger, and stuff like that. And it actually, messages from my father, that was kind of a leitmotif at Lilydale every time I go there, from not just from the Cuban medium, but from the American mediums who were there. So other than that, I'd have to say that the other weirdest place that I visited was Point Pleasant in West Virginia. Speaking of Jacques Vallée, here's a good 1970s classic, John Keel's The Mothman Prophecy, very much in that wheelhouse. And, all I can say, not as an academic, but as a human being, that area had a really heavy vibe. And I spent the night in this old hotel. I don't know if it's been renovated since that time. This is like 2010 or 2009. But I was like one of the few people in this old hotel where you still use the old-fashioned keys, to open the door, forget about cards. And people had told me that this place was haunted. I didn't see any ghosts or anything, but I slept on top of the covers that night, fully clothed with all the lights on. There was just a vibe to, I don't want to say anything untoward about West Virginia as a whole. I think it's a beautiful state, but at least that particular place, man, it didn't surprise me that people would be seeing cryptoids. So, yeah.
It sounds like you had some fascinating visits to some great places and had some interesting experiences. Sometimes on Facebook, they'll circulate these memes. If somebody offered you $1 million, would you spend the night in this, house that's haunted or this graveyard? And everybody's like, "No way." And I'm like, "Heck yeah, sign me up, man. I want to check this out." So
why not? Right?
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like you're of a similar mindset there. When you said you were standing there over the lake and you called out, "Is anybody there?" Then you took kind of a cryptoid turn. I was hoping you were going electronic voice phenomenon. That has always fascinated me. You've ever done any research or anything with that?
I personally have not, but at Lilydale, I met this woman from Scotland, Donna Sinclair, who's done a lot of that stuff. And she actually played some of the tapes for me. She would go to places like old churches in Scotland and England, and, and I don't want to sort of say one way or another what I think that is. I don't know enough about audio technology, but certainly some of the things she played for me were a little creepy, kind of gruff voices and this kind of thing. I myself haven't done any EVP work or really that much extensive research, but I recently actually reread the Mothman Prophecies, and I think Keel, you could say whatever you want about Keel, but he's a great writer and an interesting thinker. And, let me just say this. I find this sort of paradigm of energy, that these things are a lot of the paranormal phenomena may be manifestations of energy that's there all the time, but we just don't pick up on because we are limited to a very specific perceptual bandwidth, just as human creatures. I mean, we know animals can see infrared light. We know that, or ultraviolet light. We know that our perception of reality is bound and limited in certain ways. So when you approach it that way, and I guess I'm thinking about EVP, like, why couldn't there be, I don't know what to call them, energetic resonances or something like that, that are just sort of there as a matter of course, but we don't hear them. And then when we do, we kind of get all up in arms and come up with all these theories, but maybe it's just part of what, Kripal would call not the supernatural, but two words, the supernatural. Maybe this is a dimension of our cosmos that we're just not tuned into most of the time.
Who knows? There's so many fascinating phenomena out there. I mean,
really are.
I think the name of the book is Phone Calls from the Dead. I don't know if you've seen that.
I heard of it.
I did post on one of my other blogs, Theo Fantastique, on this when that came out. And that's just fascinating. And not only because of the phenomenon itself, but also because I grew up in the 1970s with The Twilight Zone. And there was a great episode of a elderly woman who keeps getting this call in the middle of the night when they discover the phone lines are down. And it turns out to be from a deceased boyfriend reaching out posthumously. So, I mean, that's fascinating. Did you have a comment on that? Or?
Oh, yes, actually, I'm thinking of the story. And again, this is, if you live in upstate New York, you really don't have to travel very far. This is a colleague of mine, actually, at the college that I teach. And anyway, an acquaintance of hers, this is like the pretext to a great horror story. So I could just say this, an acquaintance of hers, her father passed away, and I believe they buried him with his cell phone. I think that's the pretext. I think this is or if not that, then after he was dead, I don't know, he obviously didn't use the cell phone anymore. And anyway, his daughter started getting these phone calls from the cell phone, and she'd pick up the phone. Hello, nothing there. I myself, actually, now that I'm talking about this, I myself actually had an experience when I was in California. This is years ago, and a very dear friend of mine, this older woman, she's in her 80s. She passed away, and I was at a retreat center at the time, and I was grieving, and I think at one point, maybe, I don't know if I prayed or just sort of called her name or something. And there was an old fashioned, on the hook telephone in my room. And at that very moment, the telephone rang. And I remember I hadn't been drinking, I mean, and I picked up the phone, hello, and there was nothing on the line. So what do you do with that? It was a meaningful coincidence, right? It was a synchronicity. But I've heard a lot of stories like that, or read a lot of stories like that. And back to this energy thing, whatever's going on seems to like electricity.
Well, for those who are watching and listening, this is what happens when you get two of the X-Files molders together and they start swapping experience stories and little tidbits of information here. We'll include a link to your book, your ethnography, in the program notes, as well as the volume that you and I worked on together. I want to encourage folks to check both of them out. Let's switch gears to the volume that we worked on together.
Yes. Yes.
You reached out to me through, I think, our fellow colleague, Joseph Laycock, who's a professor of religious studies. He has been willing to go there and do some great research and scholarly work on the paranormal. In fact, there was a whole issue of the journal that he edits, Nova Religio, devoted to the paranormal. What was it that led you to try and put together this anthology of different academic papers exploring facets of the paranormal?
Yeah. Well, actually, what happened, John, was I have a good friend who lives out in California, in Hollywood, West Hollywood, and he basically he writes shows for a living, or he pitches shows for a living. And I actually met him in graduate school. He was an undergraduate at the time, but he was a religious studies major. So he's gone on to work in media, but he's very interested in subjects that pertain to religion. So he and I had been talking. It was really inspired by him initially. He said, wouldn't it be a great kind of thing to just trace out the paranormal in popular culture? So we've been talking about that for a few months, I guess, and it quickly became clear that, the kind of book that he was envisioning was not the kind of book that I would write as an academic. So, so the next step then was to sort of have that idea, or I guess I should say I'd been given that idea really, and was looking for someone out in the world there, John, who would be crazy enough to, team up with some stranger and talk about the paranormal and popular culture. And your name very quickly came up.
Oh,
and
good.
yeah. And so obviously I've reached out to you, and that was history in the making. So
That's right. There you go.
that's,
Well, again, as we said in the beginning of the conversation here, one of the things we wanted to try and do with the volume was to send a message to the academic community that the paranormal is something that deserves to be taken seriously and studied. Do you, not that our book is going to, shake up the academic world, but
yeah.
do you think has your experience been, as you went into fellow academics and received feedback on the book, do you think it's still pretty much considered a fringe phenomenon, especially in something like religious studies?
Unfortunately, I'd have to say yes. I think that like I was saying before, I maybe you can help me here. I know there's some sort of sociological term for this, but the boundaries, right, of what constitutes academic orthodoxy and academic heresy, those boundaries are pretty well drawn out. And unless there's something like suddenly the military says it's okay to think about UFOs now, those boundaries aren't going to change. Although, immediately on the heels of that last sentence, I did have a colleague in my department at LeMoyne. She's an internationally renowned New Testament scholar, and one of the few people who just was so supportive, genuinely supportive of my work. She just thought it was great. We have in common a love for David Lynch and Twin Peaks, so that should probably sort of settle that matter. But I think it was during our last faculty meeting, she exclaimed on Zoom, we were all there together, and she said, hey guys, in the next month or two, this idea of disclosure is going to become a reality, in terms of UFO phenomena. And I was trying to be kind of more mild mannered because I already have the stigma, and but she was very vocal, and she said, in private, she said, I'm so happy for you. You've been writing about this for years, and now maybe people will take a look at it. But I guess that's my point. Maybe people will take a closer look at, say, UFOs, because there's been this important shift culturally speaking. But short of that, I think people are still going to be tiptoeing around this stuff for quite a while.
It's interesting that you mentioned academic heresy. What's fascinating to me is, having worked in the field of new religious movements or cult studies for years, and seeing how academics rightly take issue with the way religious communities often write about what they consider to be heresy in pejorative ways. Even so, the so-called secular academic community likewise has its orthodoxy and its concern for heresy. And they often have these knee-jerk reactions to keep what doesn't fit within the orthodox boxes at bay. So it's fascinating, a great dynamic. Let's end with some commentary about the government UFO report. You and I have both been studying the UFO phenomenon for a number of years. There was a much anticipated report, and it comes out. And was your mind changed, or what were your thoughts leading up to the report, and any thoughts afterwards?
Yeah. Well, I have to say I was pretty surprised, first of all. I mean, it was just such a kind of 180-degree turn, right, from what had been going on before. And I guess I have a constellation of thoughts about how the government has covered, well, I don't want to say covered up, but really made fun of, or debunked UFO sightings. And this goes back to the Robertson report, I think, of 1952 or 1953. It was a concerted decision by, I think it was this CIA, that, this UFO craze could be used by enemies, as part of psychological warfare. So the best thing to do is just to make fun of it. I really think that that's played a role in the crisis that we're now in as Americans, in terms of, whose news do we believe, what's fake news, what's real news, because we have this history of disinformation behind us. And I'm not saying that's the only cause, obviously, but I think it doesn't really help when you're telling people who are having these profound experiences that they're really not having those experiences. I mean, that's bizarre. So I'm glad they did it. I think probably there will be, like I'm saying, more about sort of the herd mentality. Okay, now it's going to be okay to talk about UFOs. And I think what's the most interesting thing to me, and I'm really pleased that the military said this, was they didn't say that these are extraterrestrials. They simply said, we don't know what these are. And, I think, as far as I can tell, anybody who's really delved seriously into the paranormal world, that's usually the conclusion that they come up with. And this goes back to this idea, and it's Kripal's as well, that the paranormal is best seen as a solvent. It's what we don't know, as opposed to what we can definitely declare. And then I was reading an op-ed. I can't remember the author, but I believe it was the author of American Cosmic, and I'm blanking on her name. But in any case, her point was that there's a lot at stake practically right now in terms of how we do narrate the UFO phenomenon, because we could easily say, okay, this is a threat to our national defense, which means then we would have a compelling reason to, inflate the military budget. And I forget what the other option was, but her point was that we're living in a time right now where the narrative is kind of up for grabs, and that has very real life implications for government policy. So yeah.
Yeah, I will give the government credit for releasing a report saying that something is getting into our military bases, next to our military war machines, and we have no idea what it is, that kind of thing, which is a very frightening admission for the last supposed superpower to make. Exactly. In that regard. So I'll give them credit for that. I don't know that it changes the complexion of the UFO debate, but it does create kind of a wider context, like you said, for, I don't know if plausibility is giving too much, but some possibilities that are there for folks to consider it. And I've seen more and more stuff in my news feed in mainstream media now about the UFO phenomenon. So I'll take it, it's good stuff.
Definitely.
Any other closing thoughts you might have, my friend? This has been a heck of a good time for me. Hopefully it's been a good time for you.
Well, no, that's just what I was going to say, John. Like you mentioned in the beginning, this is the first time I think I've actually seen you face to face. And it's just a very rare thing, I think. This will be my comment. It's rare to find someone like yourself who is both open to this and also critically minded. And I think this conversation models, this really great third possibility that can exist in between, like you were saying, true believers and 100% agnostic skeptics. So thank you.
My pleasure. And who knows, I'm hoping this is well received. I do get the occasional private inquiries, not public ones, because people are embarrassed. Hey, can you come do a private Zoom conversation and talk about this particular topic? So hopefully having this public conversation and the way that we've done it will open some doors. And if this phenomenon continues or other things come in the news related to the work that we've done, I would love to have you come back. It's been awesome.
Oh, thank you very much, John. And same here. And I would love that. Thank you.
Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead. Again, my guest today has been Darryl Caterine, and you will find links to 2 of his books in the podcast notes. One is very affordable. The other one's a little academic, and you might want to go through university interlibrary loan, but it's certainly worth checking out. So I want to thank, again, my guest, and thank the viewers and the listeners. Until the next episode.